Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories. Take care, and wishing for you have a wonderful day. Doris Hartley had never imagined this. The small countryside church was filled with fresh white roses, soft violin music, and hopeful eyes. It was her wedding day, a day she had dreamed of since she was a little girl, spinning in her mother's old lace veil. She stood at the altar, dressed in an ivory gown that shimmered softly under the golden sunlight, coming through the stained glass windows. Her hands were trembling slightly, though she tried hard to steady them. The bouquet of peonies and lilies she held tightly began to feel heavy. Her heart was pounding. She kept glancing toward the grand wooden doors of the church. Still closed, still no sign of him. Her fiancé was late, but maybe he had car trouble. Maybe he was just nervous. Maybe he was. A minute passed, then another. The music faded into an awkward silence. Guests began to shift in their seats. Soft murmurs spread like a chill in the room. Her aunt whispered, "This isn't right." A child asked aloud, "Mommy, where is the groom?" Doris forced a smile. Just a delay, she told herself. Just a delay. Her father, a quiet and gentle man, tried to meet her eyes from his seat, but even he looked uncertain now. And then the moment that changed everything. A family friend, pale and nervous, leaned in toward her father and whispered something into his ear. The color drained from her father's face. His mouth parted in shock. He turned to look at Doris, his eyes filled with sorrow and helplessness. Doris caught that look, and her breath hitched. "What's wrong?" she whispered, but her voice felt too small. Her father stood slowly, walked toward her, and gently took her hand. "I'm sorry, Doris," he whispered, choking on the words. "He's not coming." "What?" she asked, blinking in disbelief. "What do you mean he's not coming?" Her father's next words shattered her world. "He ran away with your cousin." Gasps echoed through the church. One woman dropped her purse. Another covered her mouth in disbelief. Doris stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her cousin, her best friend since childhood, the one who helped her pick the wedding colors, the one who cried tears of joy at her bridal shower, the one who toasted their love at the rehearsal dinner, gone, with him, her fiancé, her supposed forever. She felt something cold crawl up her spine. Her knees weakened, but she didn't fall. Not yet. Her stepmother, standing beside her father, scoffed and muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Told you she wasn't enough to keep a man." It was a knife to Doris's chest, sharp, cruel, deep. The church was now quiet, too quiet. No music, no joy, no vows, just shame. A heavy, bitter shame pressing down on her like the ceiling would collapse. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but it wouldn't go away. Tears welled in her eyes. Her vision blurred. She was alone, utterly alone in a room full of people. The dress that once felt like magic now felt like a prison. The flowers in her hands now felt like dead weight. The stares of the guests were no longer kind. They were pitying, and some even smug. Her cousin had betrayed her. Her fiancé had humiliated her. And no one, not one person, stepped forward to shield her from the storm. Doris took a step back from the altar. She needed to run. She needed air. She needed to wake up from this nightmare. But her legs wouldn't move. Her throat felt tight. Her heart broken into 1,000 jagged pieces. She remembered the hours she spent writing her vows, the days she poured into planning every perfect detail, the years she believed she was loved. And now, it all ended in whispers, gasps, and the echo of betrayal inside a church meant to witness forever. Then came the final twist of the knife. Her cousin had left a note. One of the bridesmaids read it silently and then passed it to her father. He read it, crumpled it, and tucked it away. But not before Doris saw the words scrawled across the top. "I couldn't let him go through with it. We love each other. I'm sorry." A sob escaped Doris's lips. But still she stood, even as the world laughed behind her back. Even as shame tried to swallow her whole. She stood, because somewhere inside her shattered soul, a tiny flicker of strength refused to die. The storm had begun, and Doris Hartley, was still standing. Doris's knees began to tremble. The shame burned deep into her chest, crawling up her throat like fire. Her ears rang with silence. She couldn't hear the people whispering anymore. She couldn't feel the petals falling from her bouquet. She just wanted to run far away from this church, from the betrayal, from the pain. Her white heels turned slightly, ready to escape the aisle. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "I can't do this." Then, bang! The heavy double doors of the church swung open with a powerful force. A sudden gust of wind swept in, lifting her veil gently off her shoulders like a ghost brushing past her skin. Everyone in the church turned at once. Mouths parted, eyes widened. A few people gasped softly. In the doorway stood a man, tall, broad, dressed in a crisp black suit with a dark gray overcoat draped over his strong shoulders. His face was sharp but calm, carved like stone, with dark eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories he'd never tell. A quiet storm. It was Robert Walker. The entire room froze. Even the priest paused mid-step. People in the town rarely saw him. He was the richest man in the county, owned half the land, owned the horses, the farms, even the vineyard on the edge of the hill. But he never came to weddings, never came to parties, never smiled in public. They called him untouchable. Some said he had a broken heart from the past. Some said he was too proud. Others whispered he had lost someone long ago. But no one really knew. And yet, there he was, standing in Doris's ruined wedding like a thunderstorm that had just chosen to break the sky. Slowly, deliberately, Robert stepped forward. The sound of his shoes echoed across the church floor like clockwork ticking. Every step carried purpose. Every step made Doris's heart pound harder in her chest. His eyes didn't leave hers. He didn't glance at the crowd. He didn't care who was staring. He saw her. Tears clung to Doris's lashes. She couldn't understand what was happening. She didn't know whether to cry harder or stop breathing altogether. Why was he here? Why now? Robert stopped just a few feet in front of her. The space between them was filled with tension, like something electric. He looked at her face, not just the makeup, not the broken smile, but her, the real her, the one holding on by a thread, the girl who had been humiliated and abandoned and still stood with dignity in her pain. He spoke, calm, deep, solid. "I will marry you." Silence. The room dropped into a stunned stillness. One of the bridesmaids dropped her bouquet. A guest choked on his breath. The priest blinked. Doris stood there, mouth parted, her breath caught in her throat. She barely knew him, only by name, by stories, by the quiet legend of the man who never showed up. And now he was standing at her altar, asking to become her husband. No, not asking, declaring. Her stepmother laughed, a cruel, short laugh. "This is a joke," she hissed under her breath. But Robert didn't flinch. He wasn't joking. He took another step closer. Gently, without forcing her, he reached for her trembling hand. His touch was warm and steady. "You don't have to run, Doris," he said softly. "Not today, not because of them." Doris stared at him, eyes wide with disbelief. "Why would you?" She tried to speak, but her voice was too fragile. Robert gave her a small, almost invisible smile. "Sometimes a moment chooses us, and sometimes a heart sees what others throw away." Her lip trembled. "I was left," she whispered, still stunned. They left me. I'm standing here in ruins, and you, why would you want this?" He looked into her soul. "Because I know what it feels like to be left," he replied. "I know what it means to stand alone while the world watches, and I won't let you fall alone." The priest cleared his throat gently, unsure whether this was madness or magic. "Are you serious?" Doris asked again, barely breathing. Robert nodded. "Yes, marry me now. If you want to leave, I'll walk you out. But if you stay, I'll stand beside you. Not for the crowd, not for the world, just for you." Her eyes spilled tears again, but not from pain this time. She looked around, at the guests who had judged her, at her stepmother, who had never cared, at her father, who looked torn between fear and awe, and then back at Robert, This man who didn't need her. This man who didn't have to be here, but chose her anyway. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if this was real or some wild dream, but his hand in hers felt like safety, like honor, like a second chance. And so, without even realizing, Doris nodded, a tiny nod, barely seen, but it meant everything. Robert smiled gently. The church, still in silence, felt like it exhaled. A new story had begun, not with a perfect plan, but with a broken bride and a stranger who walked in just in time. The church bell rang once, soft and solemn, not joyful, not festive, just a sound marking that something had ended and something new had begun. Doris stepped outside the small countryside church, her bouquet trembling in her hands. The wind tugged at her dress like even nature wasn't sure what had just happened. She looked up at the cloudy sky, then back at the stranger beside her, now her husband. Robert Walker stood tall beside her, unbothered by the whispers behind them. His face was calm, but his eyes were watching her, carefully, quietly. Doris took a shaky breath. The petals from the wedding aisle were still scattered across the ground. They were meant for celebration, but now they looked like pieces of a dream broken before it began. She turned to him, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. "Why did you do this?" Her question held more than just curiosity. It carried pain, doubt, fear, and something deeper, a small, hidden hope that maybe this wasn't just some strange moment of pity. Robert didn't speak right away. He looked out toward the farmland beyond the church, rolling hills painted in soft green and gold, untouched by human cruelty. Then, without turning to her, he said in a voice that was quiet but firm, "Because I saw what they did to you." He turned his eyes back to hers. "And I've seen too much cruelty go unpunished." Doris blinked. She hadn't expected that. He didn't talk like other men. There was no arrogance, no flattery, just truth. "But you don't even know me," she said, her voice a mix of wonder and warning. "I know enough," he replied without hesitation. His eyes flicked to the church behind them, where people still stood frozen in silence, unsure whether to whisper or run. "And I know pain." Something in his voice cracked the surface of her heart. He didn't look away, didn't rush, didn't smile like he was saving her. He just stood there, with his truth. Doris lowered her gaze. She didn't want to cry again, but the tears were stubborn, already rising behind her eyes. The betrayal from earlier still wrapped around her like a cold sheet. The shame still burned in her chest. But so, she hadn't expected a kind hand today, not after being left like trash, not after being whispered about like she was less than nothing. But here was a man who didn't laugh, didn't gloat, didn't even ask for anything in return. Robert gently extended his hand, not to demand, not to force, but to offer. "Come with me," he said softly. "No strings, no expectations, just safety." He paused, watching her eyes. "Until you're strong again." That sentence broke something in her. Most men would offer a place to stay. Me how, Robert's words, dulled the sting. He offered her time, time to heal, time to be whole again. Not as his bride, not as his prize, just as Doris. She stared at his hand for a moment, hesitating. Her whole life had been built on distrust, on people taking advantage. Her own stepmother had only cared about money. Her cousin had taken her fiancé. Her father had always been too afraid to speak up. Why would this man, this rich, powerful, untouchable man, offer her anything without asking for something in return? But his eyes, they weren't hungry. They weren't fake. They looked like someone who had once been left too. Her fingers slowly slid into his. His palm was warm, strong, real. She nodded, her voice caught in her throat. Her heart didn't understand what was happening. It was too broken to think, too tired to question, but somewhere deep inside her, a small light flickered. Maybe this wasn't love. Maybe it wasn't even the beginning of love, but it was something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. As they walked to his car, her stepmother rushed out behind them, calling Doris a fool. Her voice was loud and bitter, but Doris didn't stop. She didn't look back. For the first time, She let someone else guide her away from the pain. Robert opened the car door for her, like a gentleman from another time. She stepped inside, and for a moment, silence fell again. He sat beside her, didn't say much, just drove. The road stretched ahead, unknown, uncertain, but peaceful. And in that quiet ride, Doris rested her head gently against the window, her fingers still warm from his touch. A marriage without love? Maybe. But it was not without meaning. Not without kindness. Not without hope. And sometimes, hope is more than enough to begin again. The car pulled up in front of a massive iron gate. It slowly creaked open, revealing a long driveway framed by tall oak trees that stood like silent guards in the rain. Doris sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Robert drove quietly. He didn't look at her. He didn't force a small talk. He just let the hum of the tires and the whisper of the falling rain fill the silence between them. And she was grateful. She didn't want questions. She didn't want explanations. She just wanted to breathe. At the end of the driveway stood the mansion. It wasn't what she expected. Yes, it was huge, 3 stories high, with tall windows and carved stone pillars. But it didn't shine. It didn't glow with luxury. Instead, it looked like a place where laughter hadn't lived in a long time. Robert opened her door. She stepped out slowly, feeling the weight of the past still clinging to her wedding dress. He didn't reach for her. He just walked beside her toward the heavy front doors. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The halls stretched far and wide. There were no family portraits, no cozy furniture, no music. Just long wooden floors, soft rugs, and cold air. But the strange thing was, despite the silence, it didn't feel dangerous. Just lonely. He showed her to a room on the second floor. It was warm, soft lights, a big window facing the hills, fresh bed sheets, a small vase of white lilies. He paused at the doorway. "Stay as long as you need," he said quietly. "I won't ask anything of you." Then he left. No questions, no pressure, just space. That night, Doris lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence than the one she'd known in her childhood home. That one was filled with judgment, icy looks, and bitterness. This silence felt patient, kind, waiting. Days passed. Doris rarely saw Robert, but every morning her favorite tea, chamomile and honey, was already steeped and warm on the kitchen counter. Each evening she found a different book gently placed outside her door. Old classics, poetry, some about healing, some about strength. He never left a note, but somehow each book matched her mood perfectly. She began to notice more. The way he would walk past the garden and check the bird feeders. The way he whispered something kind to the housekeeper and always thanked the gardener like a friend. One evening a storm rolled in. Thunder grumbled in the distance. The rain tapped gently against the windows like fingers seeking comfort. Doris wandered the mansion in her socks, unsure where her feet were taking her. She found him in the garden, standing still, no umbrella, just a light sweater already soaked with rain. His eyes were fixed on the sky, dark, endless, weeping. She stepped outside, the cold drops kissing her cheeks. He didn't move, didn't flinch. She hesitated before speaking. "You're getting drenched." He didn't turn around. "Some storms," he said, "are worth standing in." The words sank deep into her. She walked slowly to his side. Silence held them both for a moment. Only the rain dared to speak. Then he said it, quietly, painfully. "My mother died because no hospital would treat her." He looked down. Because of how she looked. Doris turned toward him, stunned. Her heart paused. They refused to touch her. She was sick, begging for help, and they turned her away. He closed his eyes. "She died in my arms in the back seat of a cab. I was 13. The sky above cried harder, as if mourning with him. Doris covered her mouth. She had known heartbreak. She had known betrayal. But this was the kind of pain that left invisible scars that never healed. Robert continued, voice low. "I built everything I have so I'd never be powerless again. No one would look down on me. No one would look away from someone I loved. His words weren't dramatic. They were raw, real, and that made them even more painful. Doris didn't know what to say, so she didn't speak. Instead, she slowly reached for his hand. At first, he didn't move. Then, he let her. Her fingers slid into his like threads, finding their way back into fabric long torn. He didn't pull away. She stood beside him in the storm, not out of pity, but out of something deeper. She wasn't crying for herself anymore. Her heart was breaking, for him, and that was the moment something shifted. Not love, not yet, but understanding. And sometimes that's where real healing begins. The air had begun to warm. Spring was slowly replacing the cold silence of winter. The flowers in Robert's garden started blooming again, shy and slow, just like Doris's heart. She wasn't whole yet, but she had begun to smile. In the mornings, she would wake to birds singing outside her window and the scent of chamomile already waiting in the kitchen. Sometimes Robert would be there, leaning against the marble counter, drinking coffee with quiet eyes. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it mattered. One afternoon, Doris found herself laughing, actually laughing, as he struggled to trim a rose bush and managed to prick his hand 3 times in 10 minutes. She handed him a bandage and said, "For a man who owns half the county, you sure lose a lot to thorns." He chuckled, surprised at her sass. "You try wrestling with roses." And just like that, her laughter returned. So did color in her cheeks and softness in her gaze. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was healing. Trust was blooming where pain had once lived. Then came the walk through town. Robert had a meeting at a small real estate office near the edge of Main Street. Doris, now comfortable enough to be seen by his side, joined him. People stared, but she didn't shrink back. Not anymore. They walked hand in hand, passing the bakery, the florist, the corner shop. The town was small. Everyone knew everything. But they didn't know her story. They only knew the rumors, the ones whispered with curled lips and bitter tongues. Halfway down the street, she saw them, her cousin and her ex-fiancé, the ones who had ruined her wedding, the ones who had humiliated her in front of friends and family. They were arm in arm, smiling, untouched by shame, as if they'd done nothing wrong. The moment they saw her, the cousin's lips twisted into a smirk. "So it's true," she said, eyes gleaming with cruelty. "You really married him?" Her ex looked Robert up and down. "Guess you couldn't handle a real man, huh?" he said with a sneer. "Had to marry for money?" The words sliced through the air like knives. Doris froze. She hadn't expected kindness, but she hadn't expected venom either. Not here. Not so soon. Robert said nothing, but his jaw clenched. His eyes didn't flicker. Instead, he stepped closer to Doris and gently placed himself between her and them. Not like a shield, but like a wall built of calm power. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult back. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than their words. They eventually turned away, laughing like jackals, proud of their cruelty. Doris stood still. Her hands were shaking again. That night back at the mansion, she didn't eat. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her coat, her eyes red and wet. Robert knocked once, then opened the door quietly. He sat beside her. She didn't look at him. "They'll never stop," she whispered. "They'll never stop judging me. Or you." Robert turned his face toward her. There was no anger in his eyes, only strength. "Let them," he said. She blinked, confused. He leaned closer. "Let them whisper. Let them mock. Let them hate. Their voices are loud, but they're empty." He reached for her hand. "Our love," he said, "will be louder." Her heart paused. That was the first time he'd used the word love. It wasn't an accident. He meant it, and he wasn't afraid. Doris looked at him, really looked. There were 1,000 reasons she could cry, 1,000 wounds she still carried. But in that moment, one thing rose above it all. Hope. He wasn't holding her to protect her from the world anymore. He was holding her because he chose her. Because despite the hate around them, he saw her. He wanted her. And she, with all her broken pieces, finally allowed herself to rest in his arms. Not as a victim, but as a woman being cherished. Outside, the wind howled softly through the trees. But inside the walls of Robert Walker's mansion, two hearts had never been louder. 1 year had passed, 4 seasons of healing, 12 months of learning, growing, and choosing each other, every single day. And now, they stood at the same altar again. But everything was different. There was no rush, no shame, no one whispering in corners or gasping in shock. The air was calm. Warm sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the countryside chapel. The flowers were soft whites and gentle blues, the kind Doris loved. Her favorite lilies were tucked gently into her bouquet, not for beauty alone, but because Robert remembered. Only close friends were seated in the pews. The ones who had stayed when things were hard, the ones who hadn't judged her or him, the ones who believed in love that grew from truth. There was no music, just the wind rustling through the trees outside, and their breathing, and their hearts. Doris wore a simple lace dress, nothing flashy, just elegant and soft, like her. Her blonde hair was pinned loosely, one curl brushing her cheek. Her hands trembled, but not from fear this time, from something sweeter, deeper, love. Robert stood before her in a dark suit, classic and clean. No tie, no mask, just himself. The man behind the legend, the heart behind the fortune, the man who had once saved her from shame, now stood ready to walk beside her in joy. He took her hands. The silence in the chapel deepened, not cold, but holy. He spoke first, not loudly, not with pride, but with feeling so real it hushed the air. This time, Robert said, voice steady, eyes soft, "I don't marry you to save you." Doris's breath hitched. His grip on her hands tightened gently. "I marry you because I love you, because you saw the man behind the name, because when others looked at what I had, you looked at who I was." He smiled faintly. "Because you didn't ask me to be less, and you made my quiet house a home." Her lips trembled. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she didn't hide them. She let them fall like spring rain, soft and cleansing. When she spoke, her voice cracked, but her words were strong. "I used to think I was broken," she said, voice shaking, "like no one would ever choose me again. Not after what happened." She looked into his eyes. "But your quiet strength helped me stand again. You didn't rush me. You didn't fix me. You waited." Robert blinked. His eyes glistened. "You didn't just protect me," she continued. "You gave me space. You saw me, and you loved me, without asking me to change." Gas filled no corners. No one judged this love, because everyone in that room had seen it grow, had seen pain turn to peace, fear turn to faith, loneliness turn to partnership. They exchanged vows softly. There were no dramatic speeches, just words spoken with trembling lips and steady hearts. They promised to choose each other, not just in good times, but when the shadows returned. They promised to listen, not just with ears, but with hearts. And when they sealed it with a kiss, the room didn't erupt with applause. It melted in warmth, because everyone felt it. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. Outside the church, a few townspeople watched from afar. Some who had judged before, some who had whispered cruel things, but even they were silent now, because they saw something they couldn't deny. Love that didn't match expectations. Love that crossed pride and history and social lines. Love that refused to answer hate with hate. Robert helped Doris down the steps. She laughed when her heel caught on the old wood, and he caught her, as always. Someone whispered from a distance, "He really loves her." Another replied, "And she really loves him." Their car wasn't a limousine, just a simple old truck Robert had owned for years. He opened the door for her. She smiled and said, "You know, I was once crying at this altar." He leaned in. "And now?" She touched his cheek gently. "Now I've never felt more whole." As they drove off down the dusty road, the wind carried something behind them. Not confetti, not flower petals, but a feeling, a message. That love, when it's real, makes its own rules, and it speaks louder than hate ever could. Lesson for a racist society. Love doesn't care about names, wealth, or the color of someone's skin. It sees the soul, it listens with kindness, and it answers cruelty not with revenge, but with quiet, undeniable grace. In a world where racism and judgment still hurt so many, sometimes love can be the strongest answer. Robert Walker wasn't accepted by many, not because of what he did, but because of who he was born to. Doris, left behind by those she trusted, found strength beside a man society wanted to ignore. Together, they proved something beautiful. Real love doesn't care about race, wealth, or the past. It sees the soul and chooses it every day.